All right, so now let's talk about reactions of ketones and aldehydes. The first one is actually one that we've already discussed before when we were talking about aldehydes, and that's oxidation. I'm sorry, not aldehydes, alcohols, right? We learned that a primary alcohol could be oxidized to an aldehyde, and then that could go one more round of oxidation to a carboxylic acid. Okay, and again, let's just sort of note, remember in organic chemistry, when we're saying oxidation, we're talking about the number of carbon-oxygen bonds. Here, we have a carbon-oxygen single bond that gets oxidized to a carbon-oxygen double bond, and that can go one round of oxidation more to have that carbon-oxygen double bond plus another carbon-oxygen single bond, right? So in terms of number of carbon-oxygen bonds, we go from 1 to 2 to 3 when we're oxidizing, okay? So if we were to start out with this aldehyde ethanol, remember that al ending is indicating that we're talking about an aldehyde, that can be oxidized to a carboxylic acid. We also talked about how if we had a secondary alcohol, that could be oxidized to a ketone, but that ketone can't be oxidized any further, right? It's kind of stuck as a ketone, so there would be no reaction. So starting out with a ketone, it cannot be oxidized again. Okay, this brings us to actually a test that we're going to be using in lab called a Tollens test or a silver mirror test, which is where you use a silver ion to do your oxidizing. When silver performs an oxidation, oxidizes a aldehyde, it becomes solid silver, which is of course got that nice shiny metallic sort of surface. So again, this is kind of a color change test where your solution goes from clear to producing this kind of shiny metallic kind of surface. And again, because what's happening is you take a aldehyde, you add silver, which is it's called the Tollens reagent, but it's just a silver ion. That silver is going to oxidize the aldehyde to a carboxylic acid. So I went from having my 1,2 carbon oxygen bonds to 1,2, 3. Okay, so this Tollens test, this silver mirror test, will allow us to distinguish between aldehydes and ketones. Okay, because if I go back here, if I started with an aldehyde, I would get oxidation. So this would be a positive silver mirror test. However, if I started with a ketone, it can't be oxidized further. So this would give me a negative silver mirror test or Tollens test. Okay, so we talked about oxidation. We actually sort of already have brushed on this type of reaction in our alcohols lecture. So hopefully that's going to help everybody out, that it's nothing brand new. The other thing is now we're going to talk about the reduction reactions going the other direction. So we can reduce aldehydes and ketones to alcohols, basically going the reverse direction from an oxidation. This is what's called a reduction. Okay, so if we use hydrogen over a palladium catalyst or a nickel catalyst, we'll actually reduce. So let's just pay attention to what's going on here. We're starting out with our aldehyde, and we're going to be adding H2. Notice one hydrogen goes on the oxygen and the other one onto this carbon. This would be a reduction reaction that's producing an alcohol. We actually already saw something really similar to this when we were talking about alkenes. We saw that we had a double bond and then we could add hydrogen gas over a palladium catalyst, or this was platinum, sorry, palladium would work too, but whatever. And we get same sort of idea, an addition reaction where that hydrogen goes onto either side of the double bond. We see the exact same thing here, right? We had a double bond that was broken. We have the same thing here. This time it's a carbon-oxygen double bond that's being broken, and a hydrogen is being added to either side of that double bond, one to the oxygen and one to the carbon. Okay, so this would be a reduction reaction. And again, if we were to go the opposite direction, that would be oxidation, right? So they're inverses of one another. We can also reduce ketones. So again, I'm just going to break one of my carbonyl bonds, my carbon-oxygen double bonds. I'm going to then stick a hydrogen onto either side of that double bond, one onto the oxygen, one onto the carbon. So this is, again, a reduction reaction. In the one they used platinum, and the other one they used nickel. Truthfully, nickel, platinum, or palladium, either one of those metals would work for both ketones and aldehydes. It's not like you have to use platinum for aldehydes and nickel for ketones. Any one of choice of those metals would work, not only for aldehydes and ketones, but also up here for our alkenes. Okay. Write the condensed structural formula and the name of the oxidized product when you mix each one of these with our Tollens reagent, right? So which one of these, what's going to be the product when we oxidize? So this is an aldehyde. Can aldehydes be oxidized? They can indeed. They can be oxidized. We can get one more carbon-oxygen bond out of it to make a carboxylic acid. And by name, I'm assuming that they just mean calling it a carboxylic acid, because we actually haven't discussed carboxylic acids and how to name them. We will do that next chapter. Okay, starting out with Aceta Aldehyde. Also, this would also be known as ethanol, would be the IUPAC. Aceta Aldehyde is the common name. Again, I really don't want you guys to be memorizing all the common names. But nonetheless, does this one oxidize with our Tollens reagent? It indeed does, because it's an aldehyde, so we would get a carboxylic acid out. What about our ethyl methyl ketone, which we would call butanone? And remember, again, I don't have to, even though I can number this 1, 2, 3, 4. Importantly, I can't switch that carbonyl group into any other carbon and have it be a different name, right? Because if I put it on carbon 3, I would just change the numbering scheme. But anyways, does butanone oxidize with our Tollens reagent? No, it does not, because it's a ketone, not an aldehyde, so you can't oxidize it. And what about the products when we reduce these compounds here? Okay, everybody take a second and see if you can't figure out what that would be. You can pause and draw these in. I'm hoping that just given that what we've talked about now, these should be pretty good. Number of carbons don't change. The thing that changes is I'm breaking that carbon-oxygen double bond, one of those bonds, and I'm adding a hydrogen to the carbonyl carbon and to the carbonyl oxygen, or what was formerly the carbonyl carbon and carbonyl oxygen. This one we could name. This would be 1-propanol. So I'm going from propanol to propanol. This isn't what the question asked for, but it's always good to do some extra practice here. What will we call this ketone here? This would be cyclohexanone. And again, when I'm reducing it, I'm going to break one of these bonds. And I'm going to add a hydrogen to either side. Notice that in our bond line structure, it's pretty easy to see this hydrogen, but where's the other one? Well, remember, we don't always draw all of our hydrogens in our bond line structure. So it's here it's just kind of implicitly drawn. You don't draw it explicitly right like that, but nonetheless. And this would be cyclohexanol. Okay, so now we're going to talk about this an addition reaction that occurs with aldehydes or ketones, where you add an alcohol and you form what's called a hemiacetal or an acetal. This is going to look kind of weird. I'm going to warn you, the products of these reactions are big and ugly, which makes them a little scary. It turns out to be a really important reaction for our biochemistry, because it is how our sugars get linked together, okay, is through these types of reactions. Okay, so if we start out, if we start out with a ketone and then we add in, we'll just pick a simple alcohol here. What happens is you have an addition reaction where that alcohol group gets added to that carbonyl carbon, right? So this was my carbonyl carbon. Now it has this alcohol added onto it, and the hydrogens over there. Okay. In a more advanced organic chemistry class, we would go through how exactly this gets added. For this particular course, we're not going to bother with what's called that reaction mechanism. You just have to be able to recognize the products. After the addition of one alcohol, let me move this over actually, you have what's called a hemiacetal. Okay, so a hemiacetal means that there's both, let's use different colors, both an alcohol group, an OH group, but also that newly formed OR group, right? That would be this one here that I joined on. Okay. You can have one more step where I'm now going to add another alcohol. Oops, that's kind of messy. Clean this up. Okay, so now a second round of addition will form an acetal. So now I have two of those OR groups, of my alcohol groups that have joined on. All right. And then actually to balance here, the other thing that would be produced here at this step would be water. Okay. These OR groups, they're called alkoxy groups. The R just represents a carbon chain of any length. So in the case of the specific example I did at the top, it was just the simplest one, a 1 carbon chain. It could have been, 5 carbons, however many long, right? So that's what that R represents, is just a carbon chain of any length. So yes, the difference between, again, a hemiacetal has an alcohol group and an alkoxy group, an OR group. An acetal, and that occurs after one round of addition of an alcohol to a ketone or aldehyde. If you have a second round of addition of an alcohol, then you have what's called an acetal. And again, you can recognize that because there are 2 alkoxy groups. Okay, so again, this is sort of going to just depict exactly what I just showed in the previous example, but let's just go through it again. We're going to start out with our aldehyde or ketone. In this case, it's an aldehyde. And importantly, we're going to watch what happens to this carbonyl carbon. Okay, and actually, let's color code this oxygen so we can keep track of that too. All right, first thing, after one round of addition, we have this alcohol group that is attaching itself to our carbonyl carbon. And notice that it's losing that oxygen as well. That oxygen is sort of jumping onto what was formerly our carbonyl oxygen. So just to get our color codons on. Right, so again, that blue carbonyl carbon, you can say now has that, again, we called it that fancy term, it's that alkoxy group on it, but that came originally from our alcohol. That's the bulk of our alcohol that's joining on to that group. And then we can have a second round. I'll even make this a different color just for, oh, so here's our carbonyl carbon. We have now a second round of alkoxy addition here. So now I have both alkoxy groups on my carbonyl carbon. And then this kicks off that original, what was my aldehyde oxygen there. Okay, so you're creating new bonds between a alcohol's oxygen and a carbonyl carbon. If there's one round of addition, we call that a hemiacetal that's formed. If there's two rounds of addition, we call that an acetal that's formed. Okay. These are readily reversible reactions. They, so that, I mean, how to say this right? Readily reversible, meaning that they're constantly going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So if we were to mix ethanol and methanol, we would get acetal formation, but we would also get them forming and breaking up all the time. Okay, and in fact, unless you have a really, really small aldehyde or ketone, so for example, ethanol is quite tiny, those do favor this direction, acetal formation. The longer the carbon chain, the less favorable that acetal becomes. So a smaller and smaller percentage of molecules will be in that acetal form if you're in when you have a larger aldehyde or ketone. You know, most important though is just to note that these are readily reversible. So if I did start out with my acetal in acidic conditions, it would also fall apart into an aldehyde and an alcohol. Just like if I started out with an aldehyde and alcohol, they would combine to form acetal. These can get pretty complicated because they can occur within a single molecule itself. So for example, when I have a molecule that has both an aldehyde functional group, right? And so most importantly, that carbonyl carbon, and an alcohol oxygen, these two can react with one another, giving me what's called a cyclic hemiacetal. Right, so again, sort of showing you how these are combining. If I'm going to go to my original or to my final molecule here and color code everything, this blue carbon, that was originally my carbonyl carbon. That oxygen was originally my alcohol oxygen, and they've combined, kind of closed that ring, tied one end of that molecule to the other one, creating a ring. And one of the ways that you can check if you had to do this on your own, you know, for homework to make sure that you got the right answer in terms of the number of characters in that ring, you sort of want to go back, double check and count. So I have this carbonyl carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that should check out. Starting from my carbonyl carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So indeed, that works out in terms of the size of the ring. Okay, but so yes, these within this molecule all by itself, we have an alcohol group on one end reacting with an aldehyde group on the other end to form one of these hemiacetals. And because they're within the same molecule, they create a cyclic hemiacetal. And again, why are these reactions so important? You know, they are a little bit complicated, but they're really crucial to our biochemistry. Sugars undergo these cyclic hemiacetal reactions all the time. So you may see sugars depicted one of two ways. One is, so this is glucose. This is the most popular of all the sugars. We'll talk about sugars when we get to carbohydrates. But just to give you a little preview about what's up here, there's two different ways that you'll see these represented. One is in the straight chain. So this would be the straight chain of glucose. Okay, but notice that glucose has at one end an aldehyde group, a carbonyl carbon, and then it's got a bunch of hydroxyl groups as well. Sort of most important is this one that's located six steps away, 5 carbons, and then one more to get to that oxygen. So these will undergo this exact same cyclic hemiacetal reaction I showed you on the previous page to form this closed chain form of glucose, or more specifically the hemiacetal form of glucose. And you'll often see sugars depicted this way as well. Okay, so this is the hemiacetal form of glucose. So again, sugars are closing and opening in these hemiacetal type reactions all the time. And then once let's say that we have our cyclic hemiacetal, this can go one more round to form an acetal. And so actually everybody should take a second and see if you couldn't figure out what that product would be all on your own, because that would be awesome. Okay. Pause this and then you can play it back to see if you've got it correct. Key step would be identifying what used to be that carbonyl carbon is now that carbon that has both of those oxygens attached to it. If we sort of just wanted to cheat and rewind, we can convince ourselves that that carbon was indeed the carbonyl carbon originally. You're going to have now this group joining on at that carbonyl carbon. Right, so our acetal, cyclic acetal, would now have this group bound to that carbonyl carbon. And if we were really good, we would also include that it has H2O. This H2O that's released would be this carbon here, as well as this OH group. Truthfully, in organic chemistry, we often get a little lazy and we don't always put the inorganic product. We're usually really focused on that organic product. But nonetheless, if we're doing good and balancing our chemical equation, we would include that water there as well. Okay, but so once we get our cyclic hemiacetal, just like we saw with other hemiacetals, they can go another round of addition to form a cyclic acetal. And sugars do the same thing. And that's how sugars link up together to form starches. Okay, so starches are just sugars that are linked together. And they're linked together through these acetal bonds, right? So now this is a glucose combined with another glucose here, right? We have what would formerly have been our carbonyl carbon, and now it's bound to 2 alkoxy groups. They're sort of big, and I guess we got to encompass a carbon there. So this right here would be an acetal. And then on the other end, we have again our carbonyl carbon, but we have on one side is the alkoxy group, and on the other side is an alcohol group. So this in green would be a hemiacetal. Okay. So the big steps that we need from this particular set of reactions are, can we identify whether it's an acetal or a hemiacetal? Again, locate that what was formerly the carbonyl carbon, the one that has all those oxygens bound to it, and check on either side. Here's an alkoxy group, but here is an alcohol group. So this would be a hemiacetal. Do the same thing over here, locate the carbon that has all the oxygens bound to it. This is what used to be the carbonyl carbon. On one side, we have an alkoxy group, and on the other side we have an alkoxy group. So this would be an acetyl. So that's skill number one we need from this set of reactions. The second skill, which is definitely going to be the hardest, is to draw the product of these reactions, right? So this is asking us for the product between methanol and butanol, what acetyl is formed. So let's go ahead and draw each of these. Here's butanol. Here's methanol. After first set of reactions, let me actually leave myself some room. Again, it's all about kind of identifying that carbonyl carbon. This is the one that's going to have those oxygens attached to it. And specifically, what's going to be joining on in this first step is this alkoxy group. So I have my alcohol that's formed from what was formerly the carbonyl oxygen. And now over here, I have that alkoxy group. But it asks for the acetyl formation. This is the hemiacetyl. So if I wanted to go all the way to the acetyl, I would have to, acetyl, have to now have one more round of alcohol addition. Again, I'm identifying that carbonyl carbon. This is the one that's going to have all those new oxygen bonds. So here would be one acetyl. Here would be another acetyl. And then I can be really good and make sure to include the fact that water is going to be a product as well. This was the first acetyl the first alkoxy group we added on. And here was the second alkoxy group we added on. Okay, so being able to draw the products from this reaction, or I might ask you, given this, acetyl product, what were my reactants? That could be another question that I ask you from this chapter. Okay, cool. So that's just the answers.